Number 10. Doctor Strange. Dr. Stephen Strange was an accomplished and world-renowned surgeon until a tragic car accident. While he survived the crash, the nerves in his hands were severely damaged, making it impossible for him to recover well enough to return to his work as a neurosurgeon. Strange was egotistical to the point that he refused to do any other work in the medical community, attempting to use all of his funds to try and find a cure for his hands, and eventually sinking into a deep depression and alcohol addiction. Previous to his accident, it was his parents' death and the fact that he found great success early on that caused him to become materialistic in his pursuits, caring less and less for his patients and more about the acclaim and the money that he was making. Eventually, he heard of the mystical power of the Ancient One and used his last bit of money to set out to see if they might possess healing abilities strong enough to heal him. From there, he would become a reluctant, stubborn, and eventually extremely loyal and determined student, and would go on to become the new Sorcerer Supreme and magical hero known as Doctor Strange. Number 9. Iron Man. Tony Stark has led quite the privileged life, basically being born with a silver spoon in his mouth, so you might think he's got it made when it comes to superhero origins. But let's not forget what it took to get him to build and operate his Iron Man suit, and what inspired him to become a hero. Tony Stark was giving a demonstration of his technology to the military when there was an explosion. Stark was injured and taken prisoner by a terrorist who wanted to use his brilliant mind to have him create weapons for them. Shrapnel lodged into Tony Stark's chest moved ever closer to his heart, and it was the help of another brilliant prisoner, Nobel Prize winner and physicist Ho Yinsen, whom Stark admired, that allowed Tony to survive and inspired him to build the Iron Man Mark I armor, which allowed him to escape but at the cost of Yinsen's life, and put him on the path to becoming a hero. Number 8. Rocket Raccoon. Rocket Raccoon in the Marvel Cinematic Universe alludes to his character's dark origins when he gets into an argument with the other Guardians of the Galaxy, insisting they consider him to be a joke, and revealing that there is a lifetime of pain in his past which gives him the form and personality that he has today, as a being who was heavily experimented on, being torn apart and put back together more times than he can count. Previous to this origins though, in the comics, Rocket was simply one of a group of animals given heightened intelligence and awareness by robotic beings, who sought to escape their duties of looking after mental patients in their care. Rocket was one of the animals who stepped in to take on these duties. Later on, however, even in the comics, while out exploring space, he would be abducted and taken to a place known as Lab World, where he was then studied and experimented on. Number 7. Two-Face. Harvey Dent went from being on the side of the law and one of the biggest real-life everyday fighters for justice in Gotham to becoming one of the city's most iconic villains. It all started when he was disfigured. During a trial, crime boss Sal Maroni threw acid in Dent's face, scarring him for life and driving him insane. Dent lost his faith in justice as a result of this incident and instead left it up to fate to decide whether he would behave heroically or criminally, often known for flipping a coin to decide his victim's fate. Number 6. Spider-Man. Spider-Man's whole brooding and moody sensibility and his battle with depression, which would only grow over time, all stems back to his origins. The death and loss of Uncle Ben is what inspired Spider-Man to become a hero and also gives him a lifetime of weighty regrets. Uncle Ben's death could have been avoided in Spider-Man's mind if only he'd cared enough to use his powers to stop a thief in his path, who would shortly after end Ben's life. To Peter Parker, he may as well have pulled the trigger himself. This tragic and dark story would inspire the hero to use his powers more responsibly, but would also haunt him for the rest of his life. Number 5. Dr. Manhattan. John Osterman's origin story as Dr. Manhattan is truly horrific. John found himself trapped inside a test chamber when he went to retrieve his watch, as it underwent a scheduled experiment. The experiment caused John to be taken apart at an atomic level, removing his intrinsic field, which is a term used in Watchmen to describe what holds atoms together, the force that does that. It's not actually a true scientific term, fun fact. As such, he was granted powers over the intrinsic fields of all things, using his powers to build himself a body 3 months later and physically manifesting in the cafeteria of his workplace. John's life would be forever changed, and in becoming a god, he would not only look different, but would also become less human as the years went on, experiencing a detached feeling from life on Earth. Number 4. Batman. Bruce Wayne was just a young boy when he lost his parents. They were both killed point blank in front of him one night after the family had left the movie theater where they just watched Zorro, and attempted to take a shortcut down an alley. A thief named Joe Chill killed them during a robbery, leaving Bruce alone in the world, save for the family butler, Alfred, who would become like a father to him. It was this tragic start to his life that caused young Bruce to grow up fast and run in with a bat that inspired him to become the Dark Knight of Gotham, known as Batman. It's also been argued countless times over that this traumatic event made young Bruce unstable, which is perhaps why he has turned to a life of vigilantism, unable to heal the mental wounds his parents' tragic deaths caused. Number 3. Gamora. Gamora is the last surviving member of her race, known as the Zen Huberis. They were a peaceful people who were all killed by a religious order when they resisted their attempt at dominance in the galaxy. Thanos managed to save Gamora and raised her as his daughter, turning her into his own weapon, modifying her with tech to grant her superhuman abilities. He planned on using her to defeat the villain known as Magus, who was also Thanos' enemy. While Thanos seemed to occasionally show Gamora fatherly affection, there would come a time when she would turn on him, acknowledging him as someone who had used her for his own means and denouncing her allegiance to him, seeing him for what he was, a mad tyrant and a villain who was selfish and cold-hearted, seeking only to bring death to whatever planet, galaxy, or universe he was in. Number 2. Raven. If we go back to the original New Earth continuity, Raven's origins are pretty freaking dark. Her mother was part of a cult, and when she tried to escape and leave, the members prevented her from doing so by summoning a powerful demon named Trigon. This demon then forcefully mated with her. From this, Raven was conceived. She was born Angela Roth and raised to control her emotions, to help prevent her from losing control of her demonic powers and to basically prevent her from giving in to the dark side. She was sort of like a Jedi, but with a demonic heritage. When she learned of Trigon's evil plans, she attempted to stop him and sought help from the Justice League, who actually refused to help her because of her demonic heritage, prompting Raven to work harder to become a hero and putting her on a path to become one of the Teen Titans. Number 1. Spawn. Spawn was originally Albert Al Simmons, an assassin who was murdered by his friend while on a mission. He then is condemned to a life in hell, but makes a bargain to return to the land of the living so that he can see his wife one last time. However, he must agree to become a Hellspawn in order to do so. The unfortunate side effect of which, that he doesn't learn until later, is that he will forget his memories somewhat, so he returns to life, but only as a faint recollection of his past, and what's more, his body is still kinda undead, making him appear as a horrific monster. So even if he had remembered his wife's name straight away, he would not be able to reveal himself to her. When he finally does remember his wife, he discovers she is remarried to one of his friends and they now have a daughter. He also realizes that 5 years have passed since his death. Not what he had originally expected when he made that bargain. Spawn, lost in the world, is now forced to search for a new purpose while also conserving his powers, as once they're fully used up, he will return to hell. Number 10. Swarm. If you have a fear of bees, or more specifically mutated killer bees, then you might find the story of Fritz von Meyer to be terrifying. Meyer became a sometime Spider-Man villain after his transformation into basically a horde of killer bees. He was a scientist in the employ of the German Axis forces during World War II. Not much is known of his backstory previous to that, but with unlimited funding, he set out to study poisons, toxins, and bees. Finding an apparently mutated hive of bees, he attempted to awaken their killer instincts and seize control of them. But his plan backfired and they ended up gaining back their killer instincts and using them to swarm and kill Meyer. Meyer's consciousness, however, became absorbed into the bees as his physical form died, and as such, he is now a man who is made up entirely of bees. If that isn't something out of a nightmare, I really don't know what is. Number 9. Swamp Thing. Alec Holland is believed by Swamp Thing himself to be the man that the creature once was. Alec Holland and his wife were living out in the swamp and were both scientists who had developed a bio-restorative formula that would solve world hunger. However, goons were sent to sabotage and destroy the discovery during this original origin story. The goons put explosives in the lab and Alec woke up following the explosion covered in the bio-restorative formula. He ran out into the swamp but found himself merged with it, becoming an avatar of the green, merging with that swamp and becoming the monstrous creature known as Swamp Thing. Originally in the comics, Swamp Thing, believing it had once been Alec, was always trying to find a way to return to a more human state, longing to be mortal once more. Number 8. John Constantine. We recently got got an interesting look into John Constantine's origins in the new DC Black Label limited series Rise and Fall. Hellblazer Rise and Fall. That's the whole long title. This is a story divided up and told over the course of 3 books. In the first book, we are told of Constantine's backstory and everything that has shaped him into the lovable troublemaker of an occult detective that he has become today. His life started in the dark from the moment he was born. His mother passed away, bringing him into the world, which set the stage for what his life would then be like. His father turned to drink and treated young John harshly, never once sympathizing with his son, which only motivated John to become more of a young vagabond, staying out and running around the streets of London late at night. We also learn of the tragic loss of one of his childhood friends in the book. Truly, it's a must-read for Constantine fans, or just for fans of good comics. Number 7. Batman. The death of Batman's parents and the trauma he suffered from witnessing that as a young boy would forever change Bruce. It would turn him into the vigilante he is today and inspire him to set out on a mission to become the Dark Knight, dedicating his life to an intense training regimen and traveling the world to learn from a variety of masters on a variety of subjects, from detective work to martial arts to magic. To this day, it's still the death of Bruce Wayne's parents that remains one of the most tragic events in his life, still haunting him to the point that he's even seen hallucinating about his parents' death while tripping on Joker venom during the current events of Joker War. Always tends to be the thing he comes back to. That and currently the loss of Alfred. Number 6. Sentry. Robert Reynolds was a drug addict who snuck into a lab and discovered the experimental Golden Sentry serum, though the backstory he'd be given in the comics within the Marvel Universe later on would be much less dark. Consuming the serum granted, Reynolds gained the power of 1,000,000 exploding suns, making him one of the most powerful superheroes ever known. Although the Sentry was a hero who was known for his Superman-like extreme level of goodness, he had a dark secret, one that was unknown even to him for a very long time. Bob Reynolds suffered from a split personality disorder, in part brought on by the villain Mastermind's manipulations, which meant that he was not only capable of immense good, but immense evil as well, as his personality split into that of the superheroic Sentry and the powerful supervillain known as the Void. When it was revealed that Bob himself was also the greatest villain on the planet, he recruited the help of his superhero friends such as Doctor Strange and Mr. Fantastic to help everyone, including Bob, forget about the Sentry, so that the Void would also never return, making Bob, for a time, the greatest hero that the world forgot. Number 5. Rorschach. Walter Kovacs was raised by a mother who mistreated him, basically resenting his very existence. This mistreatment inspired Walter to stand up to those who would hurt others. These beliefs led to Walter himself to brutally confront his own schoolyard bullies, even going so far as to blind one of them as a child. Walter became a sociopath because of how he was treated when he was younger, believing in a strict moral code and using that as his own vigilante compass to decide who should be punished and how severely. His mother was a prostitute, and when he learned of her death at the hands of her pimp, who force-fed her Drano to kill her, he only responded with one word: good. Ooh, dark. Number 4. Jessica Jones. In the Netflix Jessica Jones series, we learn that Jessica Jones became a detective and hero in essence because of the fact that she was assaulted and mind-controlled by Purple Man, who made her to do all sorts of things that she didn't want to do. In the Alias series, Jessica Jones attempts to confront her trauma, wrestling with just how much control Kilgrave actually had over her, and if it's possible that part of her motivation for all of the things he had her do could have actually come somehow from within herself. This is a common thing with victims of this type of assault, wondering about how much responsibility or control you actually had in that situation, and in a sense blaming yourself for what happened to you. But beyond this, Jessica Jones's original origins, how she got her powers, actually involved a massive vehicular collision, where her entire family was killed except for her. And it's implied that she only survived because she was exposed to radioactive materials, whose containers were damaged in the accident, leaking out and interacting with Jessica. Jessica's original last name had been Campbell, and she didn't get her name Jones until she was later adopted by Alyssa Jones and her husband, after Jessica's family's death. Ugh. Actually, Jessica seems to be a bit of a cursed name in the Marvel Universe. There's a lot of Jessicas with dark origins. Number 3. Magneto. Well known for a long time in the comics by his alias Eric Magnus Lenscher, Magneto's original name and origins revealed that he grew up as a young Jewish boy during World War II named Max Eisenhardt. His family left Germany when things started to get bad, retreating to Warsaw, where they lived in the Warsaw Ghetto. Eventually, Max was taken to the extermination camp at Auschwitz after he and his family attempted to leave the Warsaw Ghetto. Following his time at Auschwitz, Max shed his original name and adopted another so that he might better fit in with his wife Magda's Romani people. When it comes to Magneto's backstory, he is no stranger to discrimination, and it is his suffering and the suffering of others that he has witnessed that has inspired him to become the villain and the sometimes hero that we know today. Number 2. Red Hood. When it comes to Jason Todd's transformation from Robin to Red Hood, there was a ton of dark events that came into play here, which caused Jason Todd to go from hero to villain, and then of course to anti-hero. Todd was seemingly one of the permanent deaths in comics after he was beaten to near death by the Joker, following being sold out by his own birth mother, who he then even still fought to free before being killed in an explosion. We thought we'd never see him return, but he was later brought back using the Lazarus Pit, and then was trained by Dukra of the All-Cast and joined the League of Assassins for a time. When he finally returned to Gotham, it was originally as the villain Red Hood, seeking brutal justice, and later on, as Joker would say in Three Jokers Book 1, becoming one of his own villainous creations. Ooh, so dark. When you realize you've become a thing you didn't want to be and someone evil made you that. Eee. Number 1. Wolverine. Wolverine has more trauma in his life than all the X-Men put together. Actually, he's probably got more trauma in one pinky than all of the X-Men. The only thing that protects Wolverine from the darkness of his own multi-chapter tragic origins is the fact that his brain actually also uses his healing factor to basically rid him of undesirable or painful memories. Young James Howlett's powers first manifested when his birth father killed his foster father, the husband of his mother. In a rage, James used his bone claws to kill his birth father, Thomas Logan, and his mother, still recovering from the loss of her firstborn son, severely traumatized, then took her own life. There are a lot of things that came after that when it comes to Wolverine's story and his past, pretty much all of them being wrapped up in some kind of traumatic experience. Number 10. Norman Osborn. Norman Osborn wasn't always a villain, but many things in his life shaped him to become the greedy, insane, and focused, iconic Spider-Man nemesis we know him as today. It all started when Norman was young. Hearing that his parents were having financial issues, he learned at a young age that it was important to look out for number 1 above all others, to ensure his own survival. Number 1 is Norman Osborn, by the way. His father mistreated him and was known as a failure, and this drove young Norman to strive to do better than his old man, striving for excellence in all things at any cost. When his wife died, it only served to inspire Norman to throw himself into his work even more. He cut out his business partner and began searching for formulas that he could profit off of, ending up discovering and creating the Goblin Serum, which made him smarter and stronger, but at the cost of his sanity. Number 9. Harley Quinn. More of a psychological horror story as well. Harley Quinn ended up losing her sanity and parts of herself in her love of the Joker. It was her love for him that drove her to a life of crime and made her the villain initially that she became. She's now since found a way out of this darkness, dumped the Joker, and even moved more towards becoming a hero, even teaming up with Batman as his newest sidekick. But you can't deny how dark her origins were. In the limited series Harleen, we get a more sexy version of her fall into a life of crime and a fall into her love for the Joker, but even that shows just how much Harley spiraled down into the beautiful and freeing pit of insanity with Mr. J. It also tells us a tale of her being trapped in Arkham Asylum during a breakout with various villains around every corner, and not all of them are friendly towards Dr. Quinzel. In the end, she is forced to choose between the two sides of herself and ends up shattering into complete insanity after killing a security guard who she kind of considered to be her friend, turning away from her saner persona of Dr. Quinzel and fully becoming and embodying Harley Quinn. I just love too that the panel is like literally her shattering. Number 8. Prince Zuko. Okay, so while this might not be a comic book character, I still find Zuko of Avatar to have one of the most traumatic and horrifying stories out there, and I also just like Prince Zuko, so I want to talk about it. Not only that, but he's just a great villain because a lot of the reasoning behind who he is also helps to justify what he does and makes him a better villain because of that. And that makes him a better villain. A great villain in my mind needs to have a motivation that you can actually connect with. Their need to do something that goes against every moral code that they have learned or that society has to feel justified to the point that you may even feel bad for them at times, or even find yourself rooting for them. After all, we aren't born villainous. It's usually a sense of injustice that makes us feel we have no other option but to break the rules, tear down the establishment, and question our own morals in order to get done what we need done. You have to be pushed to the brink to get to the point that you actually shift into a villain in reality, and Zuko definitely was that. A lot of what he does is out of wanting to win back his father's love, and because he is understandably afraid of his father as well. He became a villain as a result of his punishment at the hands of his father, where he was burned in a forced duel against him and then later exiled as well. Number 7. Carnage. Even before Cletus Kasady was Carnage, he was terrifying, and the villain only has become more terrifying ever since then. Cletus was was born into a family with a history of mental health problems, and from a young age it seemed as though there was always something off about him. It's like he was destined to become a villain. He showed all the expectant signs of becoming a psychotic, sociopathic serial killer, and, well, that's just what happened. He was raised by a woman who we can only assume was his grandmother, as his mother died seemingly from childbirth. He was also born in Ravencroft, so I feel like that is some kind of foreboding as to what type of child he could grow up to be. His supposed grandmother mistreated him while raising him, and he paid her back in kind by pushing her down the stairs. Yikes! From there, he went to live with a family who is believed to have been his biological father and his stepmother, though I don't think that's ever really confirmed. That also didn't end well. Roscoe, his apparent dad, mistreated him as well, and his stepmother ended up dead, caught in the middle of the conflict. Roscoe was arrested because of her death, and Cletus ended up at an orphanage. While there, he unleashed his wrath on fellow orphans and administrators, even killing a few outright, and eventually burned the orphanage to the ground. Seriously, this is just something out of a horror movie. Number 6, the Broken. I don't know why, but this villain's tale just always sticks with me for some reason. No matter what, I just think it's that initial panel of Batman's like head and torso together, which is like separated from the rest of his body but suspended with like thick coiled wires, and he's in immense pain, that really does it for me. It just is like, I don't know, I just think it's so scary. The Broken is an alternate version of Batman who comes from the dark multiverse. He appeared in the retelling of Nightfall, where instead of Batman winning the day on his Earth, he lost in the fight to reclaim Gotham against Azrael, who he'd appointed as his replacement after Bane broke his back. Azrael won and became Gotham's protector, Saint Batman, and Bruce became his permanent prisoner. His limbs were removed from his body, but he was kept alive, just as like a head and a torso, kept in immense pain on what I assume is like a life support machine, but also kind of a torture device. He suffered intense migraines and seizures while kept this way. Eventually, he was freed by Bane's son and escaped Saint Batman, taking back Gotham, but this entire experience left him broken, turning him into an even worse villain than Saint Batman was. So he like reclaims the city, but you're like, oh no, oh dear. Not good. Number 5, Superman. Wait a minute, what? Superman isn't a villain. Well, not in the main continuity, but in the alternate reality of Injustice, he most certainly is a villain. How did this come about? Well, after Superman was tricked into fighting Doomsday, only to realize he had been made to hallucinate by the Joker and Harley, who used fear toxin on him. What had actually been happening was that Superman had been fighting Lois Lane, not his nemesis Doomsday. He realizes this all too late, sadly, as he discovers he has killed Lois. Not only that, but she was pregnant. And not only that, but the Joker and Harley had also tied a trigger for a nuclear explosion to Lois's heart. As a result, when her heart stopped, Metropolis, Superman's shining city, was blown to bits. It's really no wonder he became such a cold and deadly villain. He felt that he needed to fix the world as a result of these events. Of course, he went about that in a way that I'm sure Lois would not have been proud of had she still been alive to see Superman fight in her and Metropolis's name. Number 4, Killer Frost. Killer Frost was originally scientist Caitlin Snow, who had been on the hunt for a perpetual motion energy conducting machine that many believed to be a myth. She sought to continue the research of Dr. Louise Lincoln, who had been working to make such a machine, which she called a self-sustaining thermodynamic ultraconductor engine. Caitlin's colleagues warned her against following in Dr. Lincoln's footsteps, but she paid them no mind. When she finished the engine, they turned on her, revealing their true colors. They were actually working for the evil organization known as Hive, and sought to destroy Snow and Lincoln's work, preventing the invention from ever being used or discovered. They trapped Caitlin within the engine and started it up in order to destroy her. Terrified, Caitlin panicked and tore out the wires for the coolant system. This had an unexpected result, and Caitlin Snow found herself bonded with ice and basically became a heat vampire. With her new ice-based powers, she escaped and killed all of the Hive agents. Craving heat as a result of her condition, she would later discover that exposure to Firestorm's powers temporarily reverted her to normal and would dedicate her life to pursuing him, seeking a permanent cure. Number 3, Zombie Spider-Man. I know he's another alternate hero turned villain, but what can I say? They get some of the spookiest origins because they kind of have the most to lose. Heroes have usually higher stakes than villains. When it comes to Spider-Man's origins in the zombieverse, he was of course infected with the zombie virus, which made him a villain. But as this change came upon him, he found himself tragically and horrifyingly feeding on his own family members that he tried desperately for years to keep safe. Spider-Man started off his brain and flesh-eating spree by eating those he'd loved the most in a horrific twist. He devoured Mary Jane and his Aunt May, likely crying all the while, I imagine, but unable to stop himself. He was just so hungry. Number 2, Bane. It's really no surprise that Bane became a supervillain considering he grew up in prison, serving time for crimes he did not commit, but that his father committed. Bane's father was a revolutionary who had escaped the prison, and when Bane was just 17, he was imprisoned in his father's place. He spent most of his life inside a cell that was connected to the ocean. All day he would spend in mind-numbing seclusion, alone in his cell, and at night he would have to swim for his life while trying to stay afloat above the water that filled up his prison cell almost to the very top, but not quite. Crabs and leeches would cling to his body, cutting him throughout each tormented night, and insects who happened to be sharing the cell with him would climb up on his face, seeking refuge. Every moment he ever spent outside of his cell afterwards would be focused on becoming stronger and smarter, preparing himself to one day escape the prison and accrue power once outside its walls. Number 1. Magneto. One of the scariest stories out there in terms of supervillain origins is that of Magneto, made more scary by the fact that it's actually based off of real-world circumstances experienced by many victims of the events tied to World War II. Magneto grew up being trapped along with many of his family in a camp by World War II German soldiers. Now, I apologize for not being able to say the words that I would like to say here to give this topic the weight that I think it deserves. I think we all agree. But there are certain words and phrases that we are permitted from speaking on this platform, so I apologize for my lighter turn of phrase here and my potentially perceived levity. I promise I do take this subject very seriously. And if you have problems with the fact that we can't say certain words, I would highly recommend that you contact the platform and let them know your thoughts on that. Because yeah, I think that's important to do. Young Magneto would not only have to suffer in these camps, but he'd also have to watch as one by one his family members attempted to escape and often got so close to being truly free, only to be reined back in and pretty much all end up dead in the end. He was forced into taking care of the bodies and disposing of all who perished at the camp as well, becoming a Sonderkommando, which must have felt like psychological torture as well as being grueling work. Sonderkommandos were actually real-world special units, by the way, that existed during World War II, made up of Jewish prisoners from the camps who were forced into disposing of the victims who had been killed in the camps, threatened with their own deaths if they refused the work. In the end, Magneto did escape, but even then, he was met with tragedy. He and his love Magda would escape and start a family, finding a home in a village in the mountains. But after he was revealed to be a mutant, the people turned on him and his family, burning their home to the ground. As Magneto attempted to save his daughter, who was trapped on the upper floor of their home, soldiers attacked him, preventing him from doing so, and she died in the fire.
Starting us off in at number 10, Hit Girl.
But it's really no more painful than a punch in the chest.
I hate getting punched in the chest.
You're gonna be fine, baby doll.
Hit Girl has always been a controversial character, especially after the live-action Kick-Ass film came out. She brings up a lot of ethical debates about the concept of child superheroes, and she is a superhero who makes use of a whole lot of violence. The character first appeared in issue 3 of the Kick-Ass comic book series as a 10-year-old assassin who works alongside her vigilante father, Big Daddy. He's trained her since she was born. The two of them are out to seek revenge for Hit Girl's mother's death caused by the mob. Or, at least, that is what Hit Girl thought they were doing. Turns out, that was a lie. Big Daddy actually kidnapped Hit Girl when she was a baby, manipulated her into hating the mob, and also Democrats, lols, and there was never a mother in the picture. Big Daddy was just a comic book nerd living out a fantasy of fighting crime. This origin story was skimmed over as far as the film adaptations were concerned. Wonder why? In at number 9, the Hulk. Did you know that Bruce Banner's problems with rage sprout from child abuse? The Hulk's origin story is one that many people are familiar with. Bruce Banner was exposed to gamma radiation while trying to save an innocent kid, turning him into the Hulk uncontrollably whenever he got mad. But there's more to his origin than that. Revealed in a 1985 issue of The Incredible Hulk, fans learned that Bruce was abused as a child by his father, who was a violent alcoholic. His father would beat him and accidentally killed Bruce's mother too. Bruce's dad was afraid of his son because of how intelligent he was, even when Bruce was just an infant. In addition to that, after receiving psychiatric treatment in 1991, he would become Professor Hulk, a way more controlled, mellowed version of himself. He even wore full-blown outfits. This did not last long though. Apparently Professor Hulk was just an aspect of Banner's personality, and he wasn't fully cured after all, returning to his angry self eventually. In at number 8, Big Bertha. Eating disorders are no laughing matter, but apparently when Big Bertha was conceived in 1998 and introduced in West Coast Avengers Volume 2 issue 46, their creator John Byrne didn't have tact in mind. Big Bertha, aka Ashley Crawford, is a character who can control her body mass and the distribution of fat on her body. When she grows large, something that she did to gain membership on the Great Lakes Avengers team, she's Big Bertha, capable of lifting incredible amounts of weight. But when she's just doing her thing in day-to-day life, she's crafted a thinner body, turning herself into an actual supermodel. In order to return to her supermodel size, she throws up all of her excess weight. So yeah, that's bulimia, and that is a pretty thing to put in a comic. Or at least in that light. In at number 7, Green Lantern Kyle Rayner. You'd think with a hero as prominent as Green Lantern, DC would put a lot of effort into crafting an origin story for a new iteration of the character taking up the mantle, right? Wrong. Let's talk about Kyle's origin story. A very undeserved one in which the character picked up the mantle from Hal Jordan, who'd been put through the ringer in leading up to 1994 with the Emerald Twilight story arc. Along came Kyle, a freelance graphic artist who randomly becomes a Green Lantern when he wanders out back of a heavy metal club to discover a Guardian dying there. The little blue dude starts speaking to Kyle, confuses the dude bro who thinks he's hallucinating. He's also wearing a 9 Inch Nails t-shirt, might I add. And he takes the ring, not even getting an explanation for what it really does. That's that. That's how he gets his ring. And at number 6, Harley Quinn. For a very long time, Harley Quinn was characterized by her abusive relationship with the Joker. As his devout follower and girlfriend, despite the affection often being unrequited, Harley Quinn used to be Harleen Quinzel, a psychiatrist who worked at Arkham and was manipulated so badly by the Joker that she lost her mind, became obsessed with him, and eventually allowed him to toss her into a vat full of acid to fully transform her into his lover and accomplice. In recent times, she's removed herself from the Joker, going on her own adventures as more of an anti-hero, and even developed a romantic relationship with her longtime pal Poison Ivy. Up next at 5, Genie. Oh, Genie. We featured this more obscure superhero on several of our lists over the years, so longtime fans of her channel should not be surprised that she made it on this one. Created in 2001 and first appearing in X-Force issue 116, Genie Becca Parker is an active superhero whose powers require alcohol in order to function. So she's always drunk, which you can imagine does complicate things in battle. She had pumped a mixture of different alcohols into her bloodstream, which somehow gave her powers that enabled her to create seismic waves, capable of leveling buildings. But her power does not work unless she's borderline blackout drunk. She also died in the same issue in which she appeared, so guess she wasn't that important after all. And at number 4, Jason Todd as the Red Hood. Created in 1983, Jason Todd was the second Robin, the replacement for Dick Grayson as Batman's ward. At first he was a strawberry blonde carbon copy of Dick, but after Crisis on Infinite Earths he got a revamp, becoming a morally ambiguous street kid who would disobey Batman and get into all sorts of trouble. He was so disliked that when DC decided to hold a phone poll that would determine his fate, some dude actually programmed his computer to call and vote a bunch of times in order to push the odds against Jason's favor. The storyline, 1988's A Death in the Family, saw Jason getting beaten to a pulp by the Joker with a crowbar. His death would cause great psychological damage to Bruce Wayne, and many comic book creators would eventually speak out about this, saying how it was a pretty terrible thing that DC would do that to a character. The way the phone poll was held and the story was handled was quite controversial. Fast forward to 2005, Jason Todd is resurrected. For years it was believed that he was one of the only 3 characters who would never be brought back from the dead, the other 2 being Uncle Ben and Bucky Barnes. But also the Winter Soldier then, is a thing now. At least Uncle Ben's still dead. His return was controversial. Many believed it was gimmicky, while others felt that it took away from the trauma that had really inspired some interesting characterizations in Batman since. And at number 3, Ebony White. Yep, it's a racial caricature. Ebony White was the sidekick of Will Eisner's The Spirit. Often portrayed as a young boy around the age of 12 years old, his age did fluctuate a lot. Towards the beginning of the strip, he was a taxi driver and sometimes the Spirit's personal driver. While we've never been given a full origin story, Ebony's first appearance was on June 2nd of 1940, driving a taxi, noted to be the Spirit's faithful young friend. His speech patterns are also harmful racist depictions of black people. Eisner made the way that he spoke similar to the way that the character Jim from Huckleberry Finn speaks, making him appear to be uneducated and trained to obey his white master. What's worse is how Eisner would later describe the character. I quote, "At the time, humor consisted in our society of bad English and physical difference in identity." So Eisner didn't even admit that it was racist, and has even discussed how Ebony has a slave mentality. It's just bad. Just bad. And at number 2, Barbara Gordon as Oracle. Although Barbara Gordon has an origin story about how the daughter of GCPD Commissioner James Gordon became a vigilante and a member of the Bat family, the more controversial origin story of hers is when she became Oracle. Barbara has been kicking around since 1967 when she first appeared in Detective Comics issue 359, but it wasn't until 1989 that she took up the mantle of Oracle after she was paralyzed by the Joker in Batman the Killing Joke. That is where the controversy lies. The character was unnecessarily shot and crippled by the Joker, and implied to be sexually assaulted as well, as a means to prove a point to Batman and screw with James Gordon. She was a mere plot device. According to Alan Moore, who penned the story and has since expressed regret concerning the treatment of Barbara in it, editor Len Wein has been quoted as saying, "Yeah, okay, cripple the when Moore had asked about approval for the story arc." Speaking of things that are incredibly offensive, that brings us to our final number on our list. In at number 1, Tyroc. Tyroc is one of DC's first black superheroes, which is definitely something to be admired, except for the fact that most of his stories, including his origin, were incredibly racially insensitive. Tyroc, whose name means Scream of the Devil in his native language apparently, was a member of the Legion of Superheroes who has a reality warping scream. The character, created by Cary Bates and Mike Grell, was a racial separatist. Instead of just having the character be a hero who just so happened to be black, they made a big deal about his race. Tyroc hails from a fictional island called Marzal, which is filled with former African slaves who hate the Legion of Superheroes. They're segregated on the island. And when the Legion visits the island, Tyroc tells them, I quote, "Racial prejudice died out long centuries ago, but perhaps the Legion is behind the times." That was in the 1940s, people. That is some f***ed up stuff coming from white writers and white editors at DC. On top of that, co-creator Mike Grell was rumored to have hated having to create Tyroc, so he deliberately made him look ridiculous. I quote, "I gave him a silly costume. It was somewhere between Elvis's Las Vegas costume and something you would imagine a pimp on the street corner wearing."
Number 10, Deadman. Deadman first appeared in Strange Adventures number 205 in 1967, and while he is rarely if ever talked about in the same circles as most of the other origin stories on this list, I find his origin relatively unique and compelling. Boston Brand was a daring circus trapeze artist known for his gruff exterior that hid a heart of gold. This gruff exterior caused him to have a lot of people who disliked him. He was known for performing death-defying acts while dressed in a corpse-like mask, until one day, during his show, he was shot and killed by persons unknown. Due to him being well liked by the Hindu goddess Ramakrishna, Brand was allowed to stay on Earth as a ghost so that he could help protect the innocents and track down his murderer and bring them to justice. He is invisible to pretty much everyone, but he has the power to enter the living and possess and control their bodies, which really sets his story apart from other heroes. His story is interesting because it tackles mortality as well as regret, and it is a catalyst for a lot of growth for Boston, despite the fact that he is a dead man. Number 9, Captain America. Captain America first came on the scene in late 1940 in Captain America Comics number 1, featuring the hero punching out the leader of the German army almost a year before America entered World War II. His origin is beautiful in its simplicity. A frail man who has been deemed unfit for service in the US military desperately wants to serve his country, and agrees to undergo an experimental procedure that will grant him incredible abilities. Before the formula can be used to create more super soldiers, a spy destroys the formula and kills the professor who created it, leaving Steve Rogers as the only super soldier. He becomes Captain America, but his secret identity is soon discovered by a young boy serving as the regiment's mascot named Bucky Barnes, and Steve decides that the most reasonable way to deal with this is to bring the small child with him into an active war zone as his sidekick. The nuances of his origin have been explored more in the years since, but it is otherwise unchanged and was very faithfully adapted in the MCU film adaptation. Not so much in the weird 70s made-for-TV movie though. Interestingly, the first time we meet Steve in the comics is when he's undergoing the procedure, so we don't really get to know anything about his character before he is Captain America. Number 8, Wonder Woman. In her initial appearance in 1942's All-Star Comics number 8, Wonder Woman's origin was that she was the daughter of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. Hippolyta desperately wanted a child and prayed to the gods to bring life to a clay statue of a little girl that she had made. You know, like Pinocchio. Aphrodite granted her wish, and the clay became a real girl. She was raised as an Amazon, quickly learning and excelling in their ways. The Amazons lived in secret on Paradise Island until a World War II pilot named Steve Trevor crash landed. Diana saved his life and decided she wanted to come back to the world of man so that she could fight the Axis powers, as well as be with Steve, who she thought was a certified hottie. The Amazons held a competition to determine who would go, and Diana won, being allowed to go to the modern world and being given her iconic costume, tiara, and lasso of truth, and she became Wonder Woman. Her origin story has been tweaked several times over the years, with the time period changing and her being sent as an emissary from her island, but for the most part, it has stayed pretty much the same. Number 7. Captain Marvel. First appearing in 1940's Whiz Comics number 2, Billy Batson was an orphan living on the mean streets. One day, a strange man in a trench coat approached him and told the young boy to follow him into an abandoned subway station. He did, and the man revealed himself to be a wizard, and took Billy to the Rock of Eternity. The wizard Shazam told Billy that he had been chosen to be the wizard's champion, and gave him the power to transform into a manly superhero who had the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the stamina of Atlas, the power of Zeus, the courage of Atlas, and the speed of Mercury. He could transform whenever he used the magic word Shazam. So, remember kids, if a strange man ever approaches you and asks you to follow him into an abandoned building, go with him. He is probably a wizard who wants to give you powers. Billy's origin has had a few alterations over the years, but the broad strokes are pretty much unchanged. What has changed over the years is his name. After Fawcett Comics was sued by the company that would become DC for alleged copyright infringement, they claimed Captain Marvel was a ripoff of Superman. Captain Marvel was cancelled until DC bought the character and decided to bring him back. By that time, Marvel Comics had their own Captain Marvel, and though DC was allowed to keep calling the character Captain Marvel, the book had to be renamed Shazam. Eventually, it was decided it was simpler if they simply called Billy Shazam, though his name will apparently soon be changed to simply the Captain. Billy's origin is great as it is the ultimate child's wish fulfillment power fantasy. While children in comics at the time were relegated to sidekick roles, Billy was able to be the strong hero anytime he wanted with just the utterance of a magic word. His origin does a great job of tapping into a really primal desire, and it's one of my favorites. Number 6. Iron Man. Tony Stark was a wealthy weapons designer who was kidnapped by radicals. In the attack, shrapnel was lodged in his chest that would result in him dying within a week. His captors lied and told him that if he designed weapons for them, they would give him a life-saving surgery. Tony knew they were lying, but played for time, creating a metal chest plate that acted like a pacemaker, keeping him alive. Him and his fellow captive, Yinsen, secretly created a robot mech suit so that they could escape, but as it was charging up, their captors came to check on them. Yinsen sacrificed himself to allow Tony to survive, and Tony used his first Iron Man suit to take out the cell and escaped back to America. He soon decided to become a superhero, but kept his identity secret for much of his history by claiming that Iron Man was actually his bodyguard. It's an interesting origin that has aged really well, all things considered, with it having a lot of thematic weight, tackling the idea of the consequences of the military-industrial complex, and Tony being one of Marvel's most flawed heroes. Number 5. Daredevil. Matt Murdock was the son of a boxer named Battling Jack Murdock. Jack wanted his son to have a better life than him, and forbid him from ever fighting, making him study as much as possible instead. His unwillingness to fight earned him the ironic nickname Daredevil from his bullies. One day, Matt saw a blind man crossing the street and about to be hit by a truck. Matt heroically pushed him out of the way, but was struck himself. The truck was carrying a radioactive isotope, which got in Matt's eyes, blinding him, but granting him heightened senses that allowed him to do incredible feats. He trained to be an incredible fighter and acrobat in secret, and grew up to be a lawyer. His father was paid to throw a boxing match, but decided to win the match and was killed by a villain called the Fixer. Matt took on the Daredevil persona to avenge his father's death and defend the people of Hell's Kitchen. In the 80s, Frank Miller reworked Matt's origin a bit, introducing elements like a blind mentor named Stick, but overall this relatively unique origin stuck, giving everyone one of Marvel's coolest heroes, while also providing representation for disabled people. Number 4. The Hulk. While testing his gamma bomb for the US military, Professor Bruce Banner realized that a teenager had wandered onto the test site, so he got him to safety but was caught in the blast himself. This changed him so that whenever he became angry, he would transform into the Hulk, a giant green, or gray, rage monster. The monster is frequently misunderstood and chased by the military, resulting in destructive rampages from the creature, but he has also tackled his fair share of supervillains, saving the world several times. The Hulk has changed a lot over the years, going from gray to green in his first few appearances due to printer issues, being transformed by the setting sun in his original stories, then using a gamma ray machine to control the transformations, and eventually having them be triggered by emotional stimuli. But the cause of Bruce's powers has remained consistent in the many years of the comics, with its atomic Frankenstein Frankenstein meets Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde themes, providing Marvel with one of its most unique and interesting characters. Number 3, Spider-Man. We're in the top 3, but really, any of these next ones could be number 1 depending on your personal preference, due to each of them being absolutely iconic. When a teenager named Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider, he was granted spider powers, which he decided to use for personal gain, spending time as a wrestler and a television personality. One night, a thief ran past Spidey, and Spider-Man decided not to stop him, thinking it wasn't his problem. In a strange coincidence, the robber broke into Peter's home, resulting in the death of Peter's Uncle Ben. Spider-Man went after the crook, and upon recognizing him, was racked with guilt that his inaction resulted in an innocent life being lost. He vowed to be a hero and realized that with great power, there must also come great responsibility. All of this is present in his first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15 from 1962, and has remained virtually unchanged due to how strong it is. The idea of having the catalyst of the hero's heroics be his fault adds a layer of guilt to the proceedings that helps define Spidey as a character, and it really doesn't get much better than this. Number 2, Batman. When Bruce Wayne was a child, he and his parents were walking home one night when they were confronted by a robber. The robber, later named Joe Chill, shot Bruce's parents, leaving them dead on the pavement in front of the traumatized young boy. He made a vow to dedicate his life to fighting crime in Gotham City, and spent his formative years training his mind and body to be the ultimate crime fighter. When he was grown, he was almost ready, but needed some way to strike fear into the hearts of criminals, as he knew that they were a superstitious and cowardly lot. At that moment, a bat flew through his window, and he was inspired to become Batman. Over the years, this origin has been expanded upon, and his time training has been more fleshed out, but that's his origin, and it's perfect. It's dark and gothic and perfectly suits the character. It is so ingrained in our public consciousness at this point that we're kind of sick of seeing it, or even hearing about it whenever the character brings it up in media. At this point, you could just have Batman show up and never mention why he does it, and everyone would still know, and that's the mark of a strong origin. Number 1, Superman. When the planet Krypton was about to be destroyed, one child was placed in a rocket and sent to Earth so that he might survive. Once on Earth, this child was raised by a kindly couple who taught him right from wrong. When he grew up, he decided to use his powers for good and be a superhero. Disguised as mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent, whenever trouble strikes, he becomes Superman. This origin was present in its broad strokes with the character's first appearance in 1938's Action Comics number 1, which features the doomed planet and sent to Earth in a rocket elements. A year later, in Superman number 1, the story was expanded upon, introducing the Kents who took him in. And in the years since, the origin has been reinterpreted and expanded upon, but all of the initial elements are still present. Although, in her first appearance, Clark's mom is named Mary, which is funny because in the years since, they've made a pretty big deal about her name being Martha. I think this origin is one of my favorites due to how classic it is, but also the fact that it is essentially just the Old Testament story of Moses, showing how storytelling and myth has evolved over the years while still having similar themes show up over and over again.
Number 10, Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler. Oh boy. I still think to this day one of the weirdest facts about him is that he's the son of Mystique and Azazel, a demon who claims to be the devil. Azazel is also weird in the sense that he comes with his own lore as part of a race of demonic mutants known as the Neophim, who were opposed to a race of angelic-looking mutants known as the Chearophim, that apparently Angel is also one of. Nightcrawler would be abandoned shortly after he was born by his mother, who was fleeing an angry mob. He'd be taken in by a family tied to magic, the Zardoses, and later would also end up dating his foster sister, Jermaine Zardos, who we'd later come to know as Amanda Sefton, which, I mean, granted she was kind of undercover at the time, but still, I feel like if you know your foster sister, you know who your foster sister is. Don't think her being like, my name's Amanda, would change it for me. I'd be like, wait, but you look exactly like my foster sister. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd and you love when we talk about weird stuff, we have a weirdest playlist for you to check out, so go check that out after. Number 9, Booster Gold. Booster Gold is a time-traveling hero from the future, and from the look of him, you might not even guess this, considering that for a hero who should hail from a more advanced timeline, he often isn't known for being one of the best or the brightest. White. Booster Gold was actually Michael Carter, who was born during the 25th century in Gotham. His dad left his family when he was young to pursue his obsession with gambling, and leaving his family deep in debt. In order to help his sick mother, Michael would eventually also follow in his father's footsteps to earn the money he needed to help her get well again. His mother would end up being saved, but following the revelation of how Michael had gotten that money through gambling, was also shamed by her son's actions. Michael decided to make things right and set it on a path to make something of himself, and while working as a security guard at a museum, was inspired by the heroes on display there, stealing tech from the museum to travel to the past and become a hero himself, also using his knowledge of the past that he had as someone who came from the future. So he's actually a security guard from the future with basic museum tech, using it to parade around as a hero, which is pretty funny, especially when you consider Skeets, his little droid that flies around and helps him out, actually is just like basically security tech from the museum. It's like one of those things that's supposed to walk you around the museum and be like, this exhibit is this, here is the history. Number 8. Jean Grey. Jean Grey is not a character you likely think of when you think of unbelievable origins. However, there are some things that I feel like we gotta talk about. Probably you wouldn't think of that because her origin is often explained away by her status as a mutant, but trust me, it gets kinda weird. Jean was only a young girl when her powers first manifested, with her mind becoming bonded to the mind of a young schoolmate just as said schoolmate was hit by a car and basically lay dying. This left Jean pretty much traumatized, and her parents ended up reaching out to Professor Charles Xavier eventually for help. Xavier ultimately placed a mental block in Jean's mind in order to protect her against her insanely powerful telepathic abilities. Years later, Jean would join his school for gifted youngsters, and Charles would also creepily fantasize about what a potential romantic relationship would be like with Jean. Pretty weird, considering everything else we now know. Although he knew this would of course never be possible. Not because he was, years her senior as well as her teacher and her mentor, but because he was confined to a wheelchair. Those are his thoughts, not mine. Oh Charles. Number 7. Hitman. Definitely a strange one, and thank you to Pablo in the comments for the suggestion, who suggested it on my part 1. Well, I'm not really sure if it was intended as a suggestion, but that's definitely how I took it, so here we go. Hitman is Tommy Monahan, the son of a lady of the night who was based in Gotham. His mom, named Catherine Monahan, took to naming her children after the men who used her services and who were the biological fathers of said children, in an attempt to shame them. However, Tommy's father, Tom Dawson, was not a fan of this and actually warned Catherine, threatening her life that she should not do that. Stubborn, she did so anyways with him, which resulted in her life and the life of her offspring, save Tommy, being lost. Tommy would grow up in a Catholic orphanage and would go on to serve in the military before becoming a hitman. Despite the fact that he was an assassin in the DC universe, Tommy was still considered to be a hero because he avoided killing people who he deemed to be good. During one of his jobs, he ended up in a confrontation with a bloodline parasite, a dragon-like parasitic alien, who attempted to kill him by drinking his spinal fluid, because that's what those guys do. The parasite's attempt failed, and afterwards Tommy observed that he now had low-level telepathic powers. This is a true story from a comic. I mean, it's not a true story, but in the comics world it's a true story. That happened. Number 6. The Fantastic Four. While the Fantastic Four have become an iconic superhero team as Marvel's first family, when you think about it, their origin story is pretty strange. Reed Richards was the mastermind behind their transformation, which actually happened not by his own design, but kind of by accident. After facing the threat of a loss of funding for his Starship project, Reed decided to prove the merits of said project by taking his Starship, the Marvel 1, on a test flight, which would thereby prove its worth should the flight be successful, which of course Reed was like, it'll be successful, it'll be great, we're not gonna worry about the fact that I shouldn't even legally probably be doing this. While his friend Ben Grimm was always set to pilot this flight, Reed also agreed to bring along his girlfriend Susan Storm and her younger brother Johnny, who at that time really had no space or flight qualifications to speak of that I know of, and thanks to a storm of cosmic rays, the four were forever changed by the flight, as we know. It's weird that the four of them were the ones that ended up on it. Especially Sue being like, hey, can I bring Johnny, my brother? It's It's like, sure, why not? We got 4 seats, let's do it. Number 5, Green Lantern. For this origin tale, we're going all the way back to the first Green Lantern, Alan Scott, who also technically isn't really the same kind of Green Lantern as those who would come after him. Instead of being given his powers by the Lantern Corps and the Guardians of the Universe, Scott was basically given his powers and saved by the Green Lantern of Life, later established as an entity held prisoner by the Guardians known as Starheart. In the original story, in All American Comics issue number 16, the green light first crash landed to Earth and used its flame in China to bring death, then in America, new life, curing a man who was once insane, and finally saving Alan Scott and granting him the gift of power. Which I also feel like that's kind of weird, because it's like, first there was death, then there was life, now there's power. But I'm like, but you also saved Alan Scott's life, so technically it was like death, life, power. It's like 2 gifts, really. Number 4, Dazzler. One of my all-time favorite heroes in the comics, Alison Blair, definitely has a strange origin. She is a mutant, which relative to comics is not actually that strange, of course, because there are many mutants. In Marvel Comics there are many other ones at this point that exist, and they have actually become probably some of the most popular groups around in terms of the comic publisher. However, even among mutants, Alison's story is kind of odd. After learning her mutant powers, she was not compelled or inspired like so many others out there to become a hero. Instead, she wanted to use her powers to entertain others and give herself kind of a career boost. Alison's powers often get downplayed, but they are actually insanely powerful. She can transmute sound into light. She can use this light to do a bunch of different things, including shooting powerful lasers, creating massive light explosions, and completely obliterating her enemies. Like, literally, she's turned people into, nothing, because they were just like vaporized basically. But that's never really been what Daz is actually about. Instead, she usually just wants to sing and perform while on tour with her band, while being accepted for who she is by the world as well as her family and her friends. Built into her origins was also the mystery of what happened to her mother and a dramatic relationship with her father, who kicked her out after she didn't follow in his footsteps and become a lawyer. And I love that these are like major things in her series, as opposed to it being about, like constantly fighting bad guys. That happens too, but it's always like, oh boy, how'd I get myself in this situation? Number 3, Martian Manhunter. John Johns definitely has a strange origin story that sounds so fantastic to imagine, especially when you consider some of the weird coincidences involved in it. He was born as a twin, highly unlikely in Martian culture. His twin, however, was considered a mutant, born without any telepathic abilities. As such, his brother, Ma-Alefa-Ak, grew up to hate his people and created a virus to destroy them that infected Martians through their telepathy. On Mars, John was a police officer, and in an attempt to protect his family against this virus, he tried to convince them not to use their telepathic gifts, which they did try to do, but unfortunately that didn't work. This failed, and he lost both his wife. This failed, and he lost both his daughter and his wife, who went up in flames as the virus preyed on the Martians' natural fear of flames, intensifying it to the point that those infected would simply just like burst into flames. Shortly after this, he was pulled to Earth via an experiment of Dr. Saul Erdel, who created a device in an attempt to communicate with aliens, aiming this device at Mars. The device reached across space and time and captured John, who was brought to Earth and made to forget this past trauma through Erdel. The two had basically developed a mental link, and Erdel used this to craft a different backstory for John, which was implanted in the Martian's mind. And he did this kind of as a kindness to like help him get over everything that had happened to him. On Earth, John would disguise himself as a human police detective, going by the name John Jones. Number 2, Magic. Magic definitely has a pretty weird one when it comes to her origin, and I saw all y'all in the comments on part 1 being like, but where's Magic? Magic should be on here. You're right, Magic is pretty cool, and that's why she's so high up on this part. She is the younger sister of Colossus and Mikhail Rasputin. Initially, she was kidnapped and held hostage in exchange for the X-Men fighting to free Arcade from Dr. Doom's clutches. Once safe, she ended up moving to the US to live with her brother and the X-Men. However, shortly after this move, young Illyana was once again kidnapped, this time by the powerful demon lord Belasco, who sensed great power in her and took her to Limbo. Here she would be raised to become Belasco's possible heir and also his tool, with him exerting control over her. Eventually, she would return home and would also conquer Limbo, usurping Belasco to become the Dimension's ruler, forever changed from her terrifying time being both tormented and kinda trained in the Hell Dimension. Interesting. Number 1, The Flash. What gave the Flash, Barry Allen, his powers? It turns out he did. Well, initially in the comics, Barry is seen as getting his powers from being doused in chemicals and struck by lightning in his lab following the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was retconned that the lightning that actually struck Barry was in fact kind of because of Barry, who was kind of transformed into lightning following his death in Crisis. In Secret Origins issue number 2 from the 80s, we learned that Barry went back in time and kind of gave his past self a choice between becoming a hero and having a shorter life, or possibly having a longer, more normal life. Barry, of course, chose lightning, and here we are. So in a way, Barry actually gave himself his powers because of the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is mind-blowing when you think about it. Number 10, Spider-Woman. I love Jessica Drew, but her origin story really is just straight up weird. I even was explaining it to someone who is not familiar with her as Spider-Woman the other day, and even just hearing myself explain, it sounded weird to me too. I was like, just go with me here, it's a strange story. Jessica Drew was very young when she got sick, possibly because her father had actually wanted to experiment on her. That's, I believe, I don't know if we've ever pinpointed that, but seems likely, and had chosen to expose his family to a radioactive area. Her dad ended up curing Jessica of her illness by giving her a serum based off of spiders and putting her into stasis basically for years so she could heal. Now, by the time that she was healed and emerged from the tube she was held in, she was a young adult, although admittedly she was, as I said, healed, and she now had superpowers. But what she didn't have at the time, of course, was life experience, because she had pretty much spent all of her time in a tube. She had spent most of her life thus far in a tube in a suspended state, so it's easy to see how initially she got used as a pawn of Hydra's. There is also a version of her origin where Jessica was actually a woman who started out as a spider who simply evolved into a human form, which is even more bonkers of a story. Fortunately, this was later retconned to be a false memory implanted in Jess's mind, so that's how we make sense of that, although it is still a weird detail that someone would be like, yeah, I'm just gonna mess with her and make her think she evolved from a spider. Why not? And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd and you love when I talk about weird comic book stuff, I love talking about weird comic book stuff, check out our Top 10 Weirdest playlist. We all talk about weird stuff over there. It's a lovely playlist. Number 9, Captain Marvel. Carol Danvers' origin started out weird and only got weirder with time, it seems. This one is weird to me especially because I feel like it was kind of given a retcon that it didn't really need, but it got it anyways. But at the same time, I also acknowledge that the retcon may have simply been added to make Carol's origins make more sense or appear more streamlined. Carol Danvers was a security guard who ended up acting as an ally for and falling in love with the original Mar-Vell. At one point, her life was endangered by Mar-Vell's vengeful rival Yon-Rogg when the device known as the Psyche Magnetron exploded. In that moment, Carol wished that she was more like Mar-Vell, and so she became as such, because that's what happens when you get caught in a Psyche Magnetron explosion. She ended up manifesting similar powers and adopting the superhero moniker Miss Marvel. Years later, Carol has taken up the mantle of her former mentor, Captain Marvel, which is why we know her as such now, and has also learned that apparently this whole time, on her mother's side, she was actually half Kree, which is the same alien race that Mar-Vell belonged to, which also, I guess in part, accounts for her abilities manifesting. Though I think it's kind of fine that like kind of a wishing machine just allowed her to have those abilities. I think that makes sense too, but half Kree, let's do it. Number 8, Bouncing Boy. Bouncing Boy is Chuck Tane, and not only is he ridiculous in terms of his own abilities and appearance, but so is his origin story. He's known for being a member of the futuristic superhero team, the Legion of Superheroes, or he's known for eventually being a member of that team. This team hails from the 31st century, where they're teen heroes who are known not just for protecting the Earth, but also any other worlds that belong to the group known as the United Planets. Bouncing Boy himself initially was not considered good enough in the original continuity to join the Legion, trying out and failing to be accepted twice prior to finally securing his place on that team. Probably because of how odd his powers are, honestly. One day during a sports match, he made the mistake of drinking super plastic fluid by accident, which is what gave him the ability to basically inflate himself and turn himself into a human bouncing rubber ball. Why we call him Bouncing Boy. Number 7, Hellboy. Some might not think Hellboy's origins are that weird, but I would challenge that line of thinking. I think Hellboy's origins only seem normal because we know him so well at this point. But it's pretty weird that an organization who is kind of known for hunting monsters would retrieve him after he was summoned by a dark World War II German cult and apparently is destined to bring about a massive apocalyptic event, and yet would still choose to raise and adopt him and just raise him up among their ranks. It just seems like an odd choice, I think, when we consider his origins. I love it for him, but it's weird. Number 6. Vampirella. Vampirella has to have one of the weirdest origin stories ever. Possibly one of the reasons that I love her so much. Especially when you consider how many times it has straight up changed on her. She's had a lot of retcons in her origins. I think my favorite one though, my favorite version of her origin though, is still kind of the weirdest by most people's standards. Her first origin. Although to me, this one actually feels a lot simpler than the rest of what we were given for Vampy later on with Lilith and Hell and all that stuff. I'm not talking about that aspect of her origin, but instead I'm talking about Draculon, the original Draculon, which initially was a whole other planet in outer space where a bunch of other alien vampires like Vampirella lived. Instead of having water on their planet, blood flowed through and around it. But after a catastrophic event where all the blood basically kinda like dried up, they had like a major drought, Vampy left her homeworld for Earth. She even makes her way to Earth in a very interesting fashion, basically kinda like hijacking the spaceship of some astronauts who crash landed on Draculon after discovering that the life force energy powering them, their blood, is actually drinkable to her and can act as a food source. Very strangely convenient, and I love it. Number 5. Silk. Silk just had a really weird life in general, never mind her origin story, although that admittedly is also pretty weird, which is why she's on my list. Sydney Moon was one of those folks who was created as a character later in terms of comic history, but who was woven into the fabric of the original history as though she was kinda always there. She went to the same school as Peter and happened to be bitten by the same radioactive spider. However, she learned much earlier on about spider totems and as a result was hidden away in a bunker for years, growing up without much contact with the outside world. She also has a whole thing tied to Peter when it comes to her origins in terms of her feeling real frisky around him because they were bitten by the same spider, but fortunately that's in the past now. But that was a thing, and it was weird. Number 4. Dog Welder 2. Dog Welder is just straight up weird, and I feel like weird is a timid way of putting that. I don't know if we'd actually even call him a hero, a straight up superhero, based on the fact that what he does sounds kind of villainous actually, but he is supposedly a part of a superhero team, albeit a kind of terrible superhero team, but still I feel like we kind of need to count him, even though I myself am very skeptical about categorizing him as a hero, but he is categorized as such in the comics, so here we go. The original Dog Welder was downright dastardly, but Dog Welder 2, his successor, is at least not really fully in control of what he does and definitely has, one of the weirdest origin stories ever as a result, so at least he's a little bit better but also weirder. He ended up stumbling upon the original Dog Welder's equipment and became possessed by it, compelled to weld dogs to people. Despite having what seemed to be a happy life with his family, Dog Welder 2 could not stop himself, could not resist the urge from welding his kids to the dog. As a result, his wife divorced him and later remarried. That's what you do. Also, what a weird story. Also the fact that he's still holding out hope, like maybe one day I'll be able to talk to them again. I don't think you come back from that, my friend. I think you're done. Number 3. Howard the Duck. Howard the Duck hails from a planet known as Duck World, where apparently ducks are not only intelligent, but also, coincidentally, happen to speak English, as so many on Earth do. What a coincidence. As weird as that sounds though, what's even weirder is the way Howard got to Earth, which is kinda debated in the comics with a few different stories telling this tale. Although I personally like the version where it's mentioned that Florida is basically located at the center of the nexus of all realities of Earth 616, which I think is pretty wild and pretty funny and kinda great. I also love that in that version of the story, that's kind of where like Howard first appeared, was in the Everglades in Florida. It's just funny because he obviously is also supposed to be a parody on Donald Duck, so yes. Number 2. Scarlet Witch. Wanda Maximoff has one of the most simple and yet at the same time convoluted origins in all of comics. Initially, she was simply a young woman who was a mutant and was saved by Magneto alongside her brother Pietro, aka Quicksilver. Feeling indebted to Magneto for saving their lives from an angry mob, they pledged themselves to Magneto's cause, serving him as members of his Brotherhood of Mutants, or Brotherhood of Evil Mutants if you prefer. However, later on, we learned that Magneto was also their dad, that, and that the children were simply adopted by the Maximovs. It's kind of have like two groups of parents. Wanda's magic would go from mutant originating hex powers to being tied to Chthon to chaos magic to simply just magic that was passed down from her mother, who was also known for being a powerful witch. And Magneto would go from being unaware father to birth father to emotionally complicated dad to Magneto, you are not the father. And more recently was like more of an adopted father to Wanda and Pietro himself before he kick the bucket, although he'll probably be back at some point soon if he's not already at the time of this recording. Wanda would go from being mutant outcast to mutant villain to mutant pretender, having been revealed as someone who was simply made to look like a mutant after being experimented on very early in life by the High Evolutionary for some reason, and finally back to being cool with mutants again after she was able to help them access sort of lost consciousness backups for mutants long thought lost and therefore unresurrectable. Basically, Scarlet Witch is just weird. That's the only way it goes. Doesn't matter what part of the origin story we're at, it's crazy. Number 1. Jessica Jones. Jessica Jones is another one of those characters who is retroactively given close ties to other heroes, with her character having been created later on in the early 2000s. But if you thought Silk was wild, Jessica goes pretty crazy into that. She had a crush on Human Torch, went to the same school and was in the same grade as Peter Parker, and her dad worked for Tony Stark. What? She would end up being exposed to radioactive chemicals in a tragic car crash that the rest of her family perished in. During her first flight, where she lost control of her powers, Thor saved her. Thor. Shortly after this, Jessica would take up the superhero name of Jewel and would end up almost immediately afterward being controlled by the Purple Man and forced to do what he bid her. All in all, her origin is pretty messed up and also just pretty wild.
Kicking off the list at number 10 is the Ultimate Red Skull. In the Ultimate Universe, Steve Rogers and his girlfriend at the time, Gail Richards, shared a sweet night of romance together way back in 1945, just before he went and got himself popsicled. 9 months later, out popped a sweet baby that the government decided needed to be kept a secret. They took the boy into foster care on a military base, training him to become a super soldier to take the place of his missing and frozen father. He soon became stronger and even more tactically skillful than Captain America was, but even though he seemed to be the perfect soldier, Rogers' son had in reality been carefully planning his escape. Now fast forward to 1963, when he was finally at the age of 17, and the son went off the handle, removing all the doctors and soldiers at his facility of their lives. If you didn't gather that this guy was absolutely insane, he also used a kitchen knife to remove the skin from his own head, officially and literally becoming the Red Skull. In rebellion against the system that created him, he becomes a mentally unstable assassin and tries to eventually steal Reed Richards' plans for the Cosmic Cube in order to use it to change history so he could grow up with his father. It was absolutely psychotic up until that very last point. Number 9. Dr. Doom. Victor Von Doom was the child of Romani people living in Latveria. His mother was a sorceress, and after her passing at the hands of Mephisto, resulting in her soul being held hostage by the Hell Lord, and the later passing of his father, Victor began to study her books, teaching himself the dark arts, while also developing a keen scientific mind which made him a legendary scientist and inventor at a very young age. This led to him being tracked down by the US military and offered further education in the United States. It was here that he met Reed Richards, and the two became intellectual rivals. Doom wanted nothing more than to save his mother from the hold of Mephisto, so he became obsessed with developing a machine that could project the astral form of a being into other dimensions, seeing it as a way to free his mother's soul from Mephisto. One day, Reed Richards went into Doom's dorm without permission and saw that he was working on the device, but Reed saw it as an unstable dimensional portal to an unknown realm and pointed out all the ways that it wouldn't work. Doom refused to listen since he was peed off at Reed for going into his dorm and looking at his stuff, but also because Doom's plans were based on an understanding of the supernatural that Reed just didn't appreciate. Reed, however, was right, and the machine ended up blowing up in Doom's face, literally, causing him to be disfigured. Despite that initial failure, through magic and other means, once a year, every single year, Doom would challenge Mephisto for the fate of his mother's soul, and he almost always loses. Number 8. Ultimate Mr. Sinister. Again, in the Ultimate Universe, Mr. Sinister is reimagined as a former bioengineer who specialized in urban stealth and mind-altering substances to create a super soldier who could evade any form of detection and hypnotically persuade others. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, his superiors refused to allow Nathaniel Essex to test his research on human subjects, so he experimented on himself and acquired superhuman powers. But he also became a schizophrenic street thug with a white tank top, weird tattoos, and a proclivity for gunning down mutants to please his Lord Apocalypse. But his Lord Apocalypse isn't even real and is just a hallucination slash an effigy Sinister has constructed out of trash. This Lord Apocalypse inside of Sinister's head would preach about ushering in a, quote, final age of mutant dominance or the end of the world. But to do so, Sinister apparently had to remove 10 innocent mutants from existence. 4 issues of the X-Men chasing down a delusional mutant murderer were some of the best from the Ultimate X-Men's extended run. Number 7. Earth 17 Overman. On Earth 17, that appeared very briefly in Animal Man issue number 23, superheroes are a product of government experiments. The Superman of this universe is called Overman, and he was the first hero with all the other heroes being spawns of his own DNA. That seems pretty normal for a comic book. It feels very The Boys. But just like The Boys, things get really weird. Overman ends up catching some kind of promiscuously transmitted disease from another person, which somehow drives him completely insane. Overman destroys Earth 17's Justice League and reduces the entire world to rubble. And that was all before he gets his filthy paws on an incredibly powerful doomsday device that he intends to use to wipe Earth 17 out completely. But before he does that, he is temporarily transported to the main DC universe. The Crisis on Infinite Earths destroyed this reality, which seems like an effort by DC to destroy such a naughty Superman story. They even created different, less weird, but still evil iterations of Overman, like an Overman who became allied with the Axis powers in World War II. But the internet, we never forget that kind of thing, you weirdos. Number 6. Dex-Starr. It's true, the Red Lantern of Sector 2814, Dex-Starr, is an irrationally rage-filled kitten cat, and he's scary. But it's all because he really loved his owner, which is kinda sweet. Dex-Starr's origin shows the cat Dexter with his owner when she is attacked by robbers who broke into her home. While Dexter tried his best to scratch the attackers, they ended up bringing a close to the life of Dexter's owner. When the police showed up on the scene though, Dexter was kicked out into the streets so he wouldn't contaminate the scene. So this cat lost his owner and his home. That's bad enough, but then 2 sickos from the streets found Dexter when he was trying to sleep, put him in a sack, and threw him into a river. This unbelievable and unfortunate sequence of events filled this poor little kitty with enough pure, unbridled rage that it caught the attention of Atrocitus, who called out to him and made Dexter a Red Lantern. With this newfound power of the Red Lantern ring, the Rage Kitty exacted sweet revenge on the sickos who sacked him and flew to say goodbye to his owner one last time, saying, in his little cat language, "I find who hurt you, I kill, I good kitty." Number 5. The Joker. There are many variations of the Joker's origin story, with no one version being officially accepted. And that's because he either doesn't remember the real one, doesn't want to tell anyone, or is just so insane that he makes up a new one every single time. It's part of what makes the Joker so compelling. The most popular of his origin stories, though, sees him as a civilian named Jack. Jack leaves behind a career as a chemical engineer to go into stand-up comedy. When he fails miserably, he turns to a gang of criminals in order to support his pregnant wife. The criminals name him Red Hood and set up a robbery at a chemical plant, threatening and or taking the life of his family in order to force Jack into working with them. At the plant, the gang are taken down by security, and in the terror of seeing Batman as he fled away, Red Hood / Jack falls into a vat of chemicals. When he emerged being drastically physically altered, he also ends up having a complete and very drastic psychotic breakdown and focuses obsessively on Batman for the rest of his life. Number 4. Monsieur Mallah and the Brain. When I tell you that a super intelligent French militant gorilla named Monsieur Mallah and a disembodied brain belonging to a French scientific genius and master criminal are not only the primary leaders of the Brotherhood of Evil, but are also in a relationship together, then you know this is gonna be wild. So, Monsieur Mallah and the Brain, who were villains to both the Doom Patrol and the Teen Titans, first appeared in Doom Patrol number 86 in 1964. Brain was once a scientist who experimented on the gorilla who would become Mallah, increasing Malah's intelligence. Unfortunately, an accident injured Ernst, the scientist scientist, and Mala had to remove Ernst's brain and place it in a technological holding device to keep him alive and able to communicate. And thus, the villainous duo were born. The two are almost always together, with Mala usually carrying around the brain. Their story, and even the characters themselves, are odd to say the least, but so are the Doom Patrol, so it all just kind of makes sense in the end, doesn't it? Number 3. Bane. Bane was born inside the feared Pina Duro prison on Santa Prisca, an island in the Caribbean Sea, after his father, Edmund Dorrance, escaped and had the corrupt government transfer his life sentence to his unborn child. That alone is just so messed up. This child was forced to serve his father's prison sentence, is named Bane by a prison warden after he took the first of many lives while still growing up. Bane spends his time in prison building himself into the perfect specimen of physical and mental ability, teaching himself strategy, philosophy, languages, and mathematics while also turning his body into the example of peak fitness and strength. Bane becomes the, quote, king of the prison and is its most feared inmate. Being such an incredible specimen of a human being, Bane is selected for use in a super soldier experimental program, being injected with a lethal substance called venom. But unlike any other before him, Bane not only survives, but he finds the venom further enhances his already outstanding physical abilities, but with the caveat that it must be taken every 12 hours. To help that, a system of tubes is installed on Bane to pump venom directly into his system. It's not too long after that Bane sets his sights on dominating Gotham City and its bat-themed protector. In at number 2, it's Cheetah. Cheetah was initially a famous archaeologist named Dr. Barbara Ann Minerva. She was a bit, I don't know what's the word, quirky? With an obsessive love of artifacts and not much of a care for other human beings. But still, she wasn't exactly evil, not at first. Minerva stumbled upon an ancient tribe in Africa that was protected by a female guardian with the powers of a cheetah. Super cool. So cool that when she is told the legend of this female hero by a witch doctor, she believes she can become the next cheetah. To do this, Minerva has to become the bride of a plant god by the name of Kartaga. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. She fulfills all of the requirements to become his bride, ingesting a mixture of human blood, berries, and his leaves, but while things seem to be going smoothly, she was not told the key requirement, that she needs to be a virgin. Since Minerva is not a virgin, she is instead cursed to suffer severe pain when she's in human form and have an insatiable bloodlust whenever she turns into Cheetah. And finally, in at number 1, it's Armless Tiger Man. If any of you know me, then you know Gustav Hertz was going to make this list. Gustav worked in a mechanical laboratory in Munich, Germany during the 1940s, but unfortunately for Hertz, one day his arms got caught in a machine and had to be amputated. While this is a horrible thing to happen to anyone, Gustav did survive the experience, and he was later given reading material on how to operate day to day without arms, instead using his mouth and feet to complete daily tasks. Turns out that he was really good at this. Hertz developed ridiculous skill in using his teeth and feet. He even took things a couple steps further. He sharpened his teeth into fangs that he could use as weapons and tools, and he even developed above average levels of strength and dexterity in his jaw, legs, and toes, allowing him to bend steel with his mouth, kick really hard, and throw daggers with his toes. He ends up proving how capable he was as a World War II enemy of the hero Angel and an enemy of Wakanda, where he was completely destroyed by that era's Black Panther. I will talk about Armless Tiger Man whenever I have the chance, and I am not sorry about it.